Hello, my name is Natalie Ricketts, and this is an article debrief on the article 10 Practical Tips for Making Fractions Come Alive and Make Sense by Doug M. Clark, Anne Roche, and Annie Mitchell. This article centers on some of the more difficult reasons it is to learn fractions in the schools today for kids and why it's difficult to sometimes teach these concepts to children. It also goes through some tips and strategies on how to better explain these problems to students and on how to convey it better for better understanding and better learning and grasping of these concepts for students. The first quote that I chose is on page 373, and it states, "Much of the confusion in teaching and learning fractions appears to arise from the many different interpretations or constructs, representations or models, and coding conventions." The author also takes time to point out some of the different interpretations or these constructs of rational numbers, some of them being part whole, measure, quotient or division, operator, and ratio. And she goes on to describe how some of these are different interpretations of fractions, but she explains that there's this dilemma of how to make these appropriate connections because fractions can be really difficult for some students to really grasp and truly understand. I think the author is also pointing out here that there are a lot of different terms and interpretations of understanding fractions, and if a student knows one way but the teacher states it in another way, the student can become easily and quickly confused. In number 5, tip number 5 in this article, the authors described using different manipulatives and various types of tools, such as like fraction bars, paper folding, computer programs, to help students understand in different ways, so that students can become more flexible in moving between these different constructs, so that they can more easily understand them, and each of these manipulatives can represent to them a model, and how it differs sort of in its ability in reflecting each of these constructs that they may know about. The next quote that I picked out that stood out to me in this article is on page 374, and it states, "We believe that students need to be given time to understand what fractions are about rather than moving quickly to computation, and that the ultimate goal should be to develop students who can reason proportionally." I think this is a really good thought that the authors state, because fractions are a pretty difficult concept for young children. They're used to looking at whole numbers or maybe even decimals, but when you put two numbers together with a line between them, it sort of can throw some students off. So I like that the author points this out, and just letting students work with fractions for a little while and understand the concept of them, rather than just telling them, hey, here's a fraction and let's move right into computations and starting to work with fractions in complex ways. There is a lot of merit in being able to just teach students what fractions are and give them time to understand them and just the concept of a fraction. And in tip number 5 in this article, tip number 3 in this article, the authors talk about using a number line as one way to sort of emphasize how fractions are just regular numbers. And I feel like that could be very helpful for students to understand that it's not a foreign, scary thing. They're just numbers, that they're just looking at in a different sort of format. So putting them between two whole numbers, which they're used to seeing, can be very beneficial in helping them conceptualize where it falls on the number line and that it is, in fact, a number. The third quote that I chose from this article is on page 377, and it states, "It is not that common denominators do not work, it is that benchmarking and residual strategies are often more efficient and focus on meaning in their application, something so often missing from the school fraction experience of students." I really liked this quote because it stressed the importance of students actually understanding and grasping concepts thoroughly versus being able to regurgitate information for a teacher or an exam. In the same part of this article, the authors quoted a survey they looked up, and the findings stated that more than 60% of all calculations carried out in everyday life only required an estimate. And in this article, it also talks about encouraging estimation, and the authors even state that they think that the curriculum emphasis should reflect this finding. I think this could be beneficial for teachers to keep in mind because oftentimes teachers look for the one right answer, but this is stating, this study is stating that estimations can actually help students learn fractions and learn to grasp fractions better. And so that might help students in the long term rather than forcing them to only come up with one right answer. Thank you for listening to this article debrief of 10 practical tips for making fractions come alive and make sense.